Welcome to tonight's virtual art travels program. My name is Christy McMillan, and I'm the Director of Learning and Engagement here at the Asheville Art Museum. We've all had to make a lot of sacrifices this year, but one of the things I miss most while keeping apart and staying home is traveling. As most of you know, the museum ordinarily maintains an active schedule of day, overnight, national, and international trips through our Art Travels program. Until it's safe to travel together again, we're thrilled to start offering virtual trips for armchair travelers each first Thursday evening. This month, we travel to the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York City. As I was researching possible destinations for our first virtual trip, I came across the Whitney's current exhibition, Making Knowing, Craft and Art 1950 to 2019. And knew that because of the topic and the artists included, it would appeal to our travelers. We also announced earlier this week that our next special exhibition, Vantage Points, Contemporary Photography from the Whitney Museum of American Art, is opening soon on December 17th for members and December 18th for the public. So it seemed like a great fit to see more of what the Whitney has to offer. Tonight, we're joined by two colleagues from the Whitney Museum. Jennie Goldstein is an assistant curator at the Whitney. Most recently, she co-curated Making Knowing, which is on view through early 2022. Other recent projects include Christine's son, Kim, Too Much Future, and An Incomplete History of Protest, selections from the Whitney Museum, 1940 to 2017. Jennie is joined by Elisabeth Sherman, who is also an assistant curator at the Whitney. In addition to Making Knowing, she's working on Daoud Bay, an American project, which opens at the Whitney in April 2021. She most recently oversaw Zoe Leonard Survey, as well as co-curated Between the Waters, both in 2018. She has written for numerous exhibition catalogs, as well as contributed to Artforum and Art in America. Jennie and Elisabeth will introduce the Whitney Museum, its collection and building, then discuss their exhibition, Making Knowing, Craft and Art, 1950 to 2019. During the program, please add any questions that you have to the chat box. We'll leave time at the end of the evening for Q&A. Please join me in welcoming Jennie Goldstein and Elisabeth Sherman.
Thanks, Christy. Can you all hear me? Okay, great. I'm going to share my screen now. Wait for it to load. Thank you all so much for having us. Elisabeth and I are always so happy to talk about Making Knowing, a show that is very near and dear to our hearts, and one that, because of COVID, has been extended and will be on view until February of 2022. So hopefully this means that some of you will, in fact, be able to travel to the Whitney and see this show. And before we dig into the exhibition, we're actually going to give a little bit of background about the building's history. And to do that, I wanted to start by situating us in time and place. What you see on your screen is the museum in its current instantiation. These are photographs that were taken in 2015. And I want to begin by letting everybody know that the Whitney is located on Lenape-Hoking, which is the ancestral homelands of the Lenape. And the name Manhattan actually comes from their word, Mannahatta, which means island of many hills. And the Lenape, of course, are still here. Some are citizens of the Nanticoke Lenni Lenape tribal nation in what is currently known as New Jersey. Others are part of the larger Lenape diaspora, the lived consequence of settler colonialism, recognized federally as the Delaware Nation of Oklahoma, the Delaware Tribe of Indians, also in Oklahoma, the Stockbridge-Muncie community in Wisconsin, and the Muncie-Delaware Nation and the Delaware of Six Nations in what is now known as Canada. But before European settlers arrived, there was a Lenape fishing and planting site called Sapacanacan, or Tobacco Field, near what is currently the foot of Gansevoort Street, so the street that runs down in front of the museum towards where you can see the Hudson River there. This site and the city itself have long been and continues to be an important place for many Indigenous people. So I want to acknowledge the forced displacement of this region's original inhabitants, as well as the continued vitality of Indigenous peoples in what is today known as New York City. And I also want to recognize the historical exclusion of Indigenous art and artists from the narratives and histories that the museum has so often produced. And as a museum of American art, we have a distinct responsibility to make present Indigenous art, artists, and perspectives. And you'll see a little bit of that in Making Knowing, but much more work to be done. When the Whitney moved downtown, we were essentially doing a kind of homecoming. The museum was founded by a woman named Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, and we're going to go through these slides kind of quickly. So I realize they're a little bit low res, so don't worry about it. This is just to kind of place you in New York history. Her name might signal something to you. She was born into the Vanderbilt family, which was the wealthiest family in the United States at the turn of the 20th century, and then married into yet another extremely wealthy family and was under tremendous pressure to lead a kind of traditional socialite lifestyle, but she was an artist and one who really wanted to thrive as an artist. She led a kind of dual life, one part uptown, one part downtown, a kind of bohemian artist community that she helped to found in Manhattan's West Village, not far from where the Whitney is now. But she struggled to get commissions. She struggled to find place for her art. And she noticed that the artists in her community were similarly struggling to find patrons and support and places to show. In the early decades of the 20th century, there was no real infrastructure to support contemporary American art. There was no Whitney Museum. There wasn't even a MoMA. If you wanted to do anything radical, you made your way to Europe as fast as you could. So she really wanted to help foster a community. And basically what she did was open up her home on West 8th Street. She started a club, a place where artists could hang out, show, take classes, drink alcohol during Prohibition, be together in community and find other like-minded makers. She also bought a lot of art, often helping artists just when they needed it the most. And eventually she realized that she'd amassed such a collection of objects that she needed to do something with them. She had like 500 paintings and sculptures by contemporary American artists. She went to the director of the Metropolitan Museum in 1929. That was the only game in town. She said, "Can I donate this to you?" And they were like, "No thanks." Basically, that art's going to sit in the basement. We won't do anything with it. And so a real vacuum emerged, and she thought, I should really turn my club into a proper museum. And that's precisely what she did. So the museum was founded at West 8th Street in a series of connected brownstones in 1931, and that's when we opened our doors. But you can see some of that kind of domestic feel from the Studio Club days remain. So curtains in the windows, paintings and sculptures hanging above pieces of furniture. There's really that sense of a kind of an exhibition style that you don't see anymore, that's tied to her own background as somebody essentially opening her home to artists. And as you can imagine, we soon grew out of that space, and the museum actually moved next door to MoMA, and in 1954 opened with recent acquisitions. And what I love about this installation shot that you can see here is that what's visible is a Franz Klein painting and a Joan Mitchell painting, both of which are on view in our galleries right now. So there's a real kind of continuation of this history. We soon grew out of that space and built a new building uptown on Madison Avenue, the Marcel Breuer Design Building, which opened in 1966. And maybe some of you on this call have been in this building, which was the Whitney's home for decades. And, as the collection grew and the programming needs shifted and changed, the museum essentially tried many, many times to expand on this site. The idea that we would move again was just like the last thing on anybody's mind for decades. There were so many failed attempts to expand at the Breuer Building uptown. There was a Michael Graves, high postmodern attempt in the mid 1980s. You can see the model here. Then Rem Koolhaas, his expansion proposal in 2002. This is for longtime Whitney people like Elisabeth and me. This is like such a trip down memory lane to see some of this old stuff. And none of these plans made it. The closest we ever got was with Renzo Piano, who wanted to expand on the Breuer site. And this got very, very close. In fact, we really thought this is what we were all going to move into. And some of the neighborhood residents were really against this sort of tower being built up next to the Marcel Breuer building, because as you can imagine, many folks were not that interested in giving up their park views. And there was a lot of, it was a lot more trouble than I think the space we were going to get out of it made felt worth. So all of a sudden, this possibility of moving downtown to the meatpacking district, to the southern tip of the Highline Park, which maybe some of you have walked on before, emerged. And then all of a sudden there was this possibility that we could just start over, build a new building, try something completely different. And that's exactly what we did, and built the home that we're in now. And now I think it's impossible to imagine ever being anywhere else, because we finally have a space that is capacious, that has flexibility, that has a real theater, has real education resources, has kind of everything that we needed to really dig in with some of our kind of most core values. And a lot of those values are centered on and through the Whitney's collection, which is some 25,000 things and always growing. So I'm going to hand it to Elisabeth, who will help set the stage for Making Knowing.
Thanks so much, Jenny. And I just wanted to thank you all again for having us tonight. This is such a treat, and I just wish we could all be together in person. So to kind of continue the story that Jenny laid the groundwork for, at this really fundamentally transformative moment for the institution of moving downtown to a new building with significantly increased square footage, it was also an incredible opportunity to rethink what our collection was, not only as an accumulation of 26,000 plus objects, but also how does an institution display that collection? And you know, historically, and still in most institutions, collection displays are very static presentations. You kind of put them up and they tell this one kind of narrative of whatever art history the institution is dedicated to, and things rotate out periodically for conservation reasons, for loan reasons, for new acquisition reasons, but otherwise that narrative is really fairly fixed. And one of the projects that kind of led to the opening of the new building was really to kind of relearn what our collection was, and therefore what stories did we want to tell. So actually in the years leading up to this move, we did a number of these kind of test case exhibitions at the Breuer building, looking at different decades of our collection and trying to tease out different narratives, all leading up to an enormous project of America's Hard to See, which inaugurated the new building. And I hope you had a chance to read through that previous slide. I hate when there's text on a screen and it is just sort of read, but those are the kind of guiding principles that led to our inaugural display of our collection, and the guiding principles that really drive us today. So America's Hard to See filled the entirety of our new piano building from, you know, top down, and was this great chance again to look at cross-medium displays, writing new narratives, examining what it means to have an American collection, all of the things that you saw on that screen. And then what's been so exciting for us as curators, and I think for the public, although I won't speak on behalf of the publics, has been that our collection has not been fixed, has not been static. And so since America's Hard to See, we've had a series of exhibitions, mainly on our 6th floor, which is where Making Knowing is, should you come to the museum. These series of exhibitions from the collection, and they're thematic exhibitions, taking a different slice into the collection and teasing out these themes. So one of them, which Jenny was one of the curators on, a fantastic, in some ways very prescient exhibition, was called An Incomplete History of Protest, selection from the Whitney's collection, 1940 to 2017. And this show looked at protest art in that time period in our collection. And we've kind of joked since that every one of these shows should really start with the title, An Incomplete History of, insert thematic here, because necessarily when you're doing a collection show, it is an incomplete history. You cannot get loans from wherever you want and kind of pull together a narrative driven simply by your thesis. You have to do this this work that is both telling a story to the public, but also telling the story of the institution at the same time, both what we have and very much what we don't have. So one other of these thematic shows before I get to Making Knowing was called Programmed Rules, Codes, and Choreographies in Art, which really looked at new media, digital art, how codes and sort of technology underpins a lot of different art. It was incredible. And I could talk about it all day, but we will linger on these shows. And so then we had the opportunity to work on the show that we're here to talk to you about today. And so to just pick up the thread, pun intended, it's impossible not to sprinkle one speech with craft metaphors. But to tell this story, this complicated, very incomplete, very inconsistent story of the kind of materials, methods, and strategies of craft in the Whitney's collection from kind of mid-century forward. So I want to define that a little bit, and then we'll start to kind of walk into the show, and I'll pass it back to Jenny. But when you come off the elevators into the gallery, and this is kind of an oblique view of how you would enter the floor, the first work you see is this Ree Morton, Signs of Love from 1976. And there were a lot of reasons we wanted to start the show with this work. Some of them were practical in that it is incredibly long and there were very few places in the show we could have placed it, but also because we very intentionally wanted to both reinforce and undermine the visitors' expectations of what they were going to see coming to see a craft show. So you exit the elevator and you see this large, kind of almost theatrical narrative display of all of these different objects that has the feeling of the domestic, which we associate with craft, these baskets overflowing with kind of fabric, you know, curtain sways, ladders, things that seem like they're made out of fabric, that they're very much handmade. And so we associate with craft traditions with the feminine and the domestic, which are so closely associated with craft. But when you get up close, when you read the wall label, you realize none of this is actually fabric. None of this is actually a traditional kind of studio craft material. It's actually all painting materials, canvases coated in a kind of plastic that is liquid at first and then hardens into these shapes and covered in paint. And so it's actually kind of traditional fine art materials made to look like craft. And that's how we really wanted to start the show, to say, first of all, this category of craft is fairly false. The separation between fine art and craft is, you know, one that we could talk this entire time about in the history of and why we have this in the West, but one that we're increasingly interested in helping to dismantle. And so we're going to show you something that maybe straddles the line. Yeah, my thought danced away from me, but why don't we start into the show and I'll turn it back to Jenny.
Thanks, Elizabeth. It's so fun to revisit this show since we're like not really allowed to go into the office that much. We don't get to see, our offices are like right here on, you know, like so close to these gallery spaces. So as Elizabeth was saying, we wanted to start in this way to almost like undermine expectations right off the bat. The show starts in the 1970s, right at the height of second wave feminism, right as so many artists, especially women artists, were finding themselves to be, you know, facing gender-based exclusion from the art world and wanted to essentially say like, okay, you're not interested in me, you're not interested in these materials. Well, I'm going to make huge, massive installations with precisely the politics and precisely the materials that you're deeming quote unquote unworthy or not as important as other types of baking that have a kind of canonical status within the contemporary art world. And that kind of politic, that kind of upending of expectations really courses throughout the whole show, which in fact ranges from the 50s to the present and unfolds in a kind of chronological and thematic sequence. So what we found is that artists throughout the 7-ish decades that this show covers, have always been invested in materials that we associate with craft, have always been thinking about the ways in which they can disrupt the kinds of hierarchies that exist in the art world, bring the marginal to the center, and help us understand the world around us anew, which is so essential to so many artists' ways of thinking or modes of being. And in the opening galleries, we wanted to explore this question of what was happening with abstraction at mid-century. In the 1950s, many artists were deeply invested in this project of kind of emptying out the representational, emptying out the recognizable world as we know it, and exploring these more kind of conceptual, more kind of philosophical questions of what the imagery and content of art can be or should mean. And no big surprise, artists who were interested in abstraction were also interested in craft techniques. So there's this kind of interesting overlap that occurs. One of the great joys of this project for Elisabeth and me is that it allowed us to do some targeted acquisitions. When Elisabeth was joking earlier about every show should be an incomplete history of X, it's really true. You know, we set out to do this show and we were like, oh my God, the Whitney doesn't have Annie Albers. Like, how are we going to do a show about craft without Annie Albers? And we were like, cancel it. You know, we're ready to go into the chief curator's office to say like, absolutely not. Like, stop, like we can't do this. But instead of panicking, we decided we would look into what was possible. And interestingly, we were able to acquire a suite of prints. And what's so fascinating about this is if you know Albers's work at all, you know that she was a weaver, kind of radical textile maker. But she actually gave up weaving in the 1960s when she discovered printmaking, because she found that she could do things with line and texture that kind of continued the work of the loom in ways that kind of expanded her thinking and expanded her mind. And you can certainly see that in line involvements here, where you can almost imagine like this thread of the loom coming off of the support and making its way onto this totally different kind of medium. So thinking about the way in which craft kind of zigs and zags out of where we might expect it to be and lands in unexpected places was something that was really exciting for us. And there was a way in which many artists were kind of hanging out together and thinking about some of these ideas. In fact, Albers, it's like I'm telling you guys things you know so well because of where you're geographically located, but the Alberses had an outsized influence on so many young artists who were spending time at Black Mountain College. So we actually have our like Black Mountain College wall here, where you have Ruth Asawa, Robert Rauschenberg, and Peter Vulkos, all of whom were either students or teachers at Black Mountain College at one point or another. So for us to think about weaving with wire or painting with textiles or using clay in gestural modes, was a way to kind of expand this idea of what abstraction meant at this time. Let's see, here are some details, closer up shots of what I was just talking about. And then we also wanted to hint at this other kind of gathering or consortium of artists who were living together on Lower Manhattan's tip in a neighborhood called Coenty Slip in the 50s and 60s. And this included artists like Ellsworth Kelly and Lenore Tawney and Agnes Martin, all of whom were trying to kind of get away from the dominant Abex culture and do something different. And here you see artists like Tawney really experimenting with what you can do on and off the loom. And at the same time, we really wanted to get at this core value we have about cross-medium display. How could we think about the way craft is manifest in places you might not expect it, like even in performance or in films or dance made explicitly for film, which is what you see here. So we wanted to include this beautiful video documentation of a screen dance that was made by a choreographer in collaboration with a poet and a writer, but all performed within Lenore Tawney installations. And you can even see our Lenore Tawney in the background of this still. So really getting at the ways in which artists were pushing the limits of abstraction at this time, away from maybe some of the expected conversations about either Abex or hard edge abstraction or geometric abstraction, and into these possibilities that craft materials and methods made possible.
So then if you were in the galleries, you would round the bend and come into the next room and encounter what we refer to as our pop corner. We had lots of debates about did pop art fit in this story? If so, where and how? And this corner was our answer to that question. So here you see works by 3 artists. On the left, you see Claes Oldenburg's giant BLT. In the back, you see Yayoi Kusama's accumulation. And on the right, you see Richard Artschwager's description of a table. And besides this kind of cheeky arrangement, nodding at maybe somebody's lunch with their table and their chair, that was fun for us to put together, we really liked taking this view of pop, something that a story that the Whitney tells often in our collection displays, something that we I think consider a strength of the institution, and really look at it in a different way. Look at these figures that don't always fit so neatly into the story of pop, and these objects that in this context maybe we can see differently. Obviously, when we think about pop and we think about mass production and consumerism and kind of sleek finishes and mechanically made objects, or the appearance of mechanically made objects, here we're really looking at the hand, and how are these artists kind of subverting those ideas, playing with those ideas in using these materials. And so one of the stories we like to tell is not only, you know, this wonderful Oldenburg piece, which looks great here, but when you're in front of it, this really, like all of his work, this totally oversized, ridiculous sandwich is just has such a personality. But the work was actually stitched by his then wife, Patty Muka. And for us, that sense of whose labor is valued, whose name gets put on the work of art, what becomes visible and invisible, especially at this moment, was very important. And then if you can see, kind of coming out of the top of the sandwich, literally holding it all together, is this very finely turned wooden toothpick. And it is the only piece of wood carving in the whole show. In all of these ways that we discovered things about our collection, we found that kind of woodworking is just not something that we have. We have lots of objects made of wood, but not objects that would sort of be traditionally thought of as woodworking. So we really liked that we could include it in that way. And the toothpick was actually carved by Richard Artschwager, Oldenburg's friend, his adjacency on this platform, who began his his professional life as a furniture maker. So he really moved from something traditionally considered craft into fine art. And then you enter this room that really thinks about, you know, Jennie was kind of talking about these, how the artists in the decade before were thinking about abstraction and challenging abstraction through these materials. And you see this kind of continuation of these ideas in process-based abstract works. So in this room, the materials really take over. It's the artists are using these materials, which they most likely would not have considered craft materials, but we can see them as such, and allowing them to define the work of art. So I'm not sure if we have close-ups of these works, but I'll talk a little bit briefly about Robert Morris and Eva Hess, who I think Jennie has the pointer, but on the left and on the right on the back wall. Both of these works, these artists, again, allowed the materials to make themselves. The Hesse rope piece is really one of the highlights of our collection. It's a real treasure to have, and something that we won't have forever because of its absolute fragility. And it's a work that she made really at the end of her life, that was in her studio when she passed. And what she did was she took this rope, this very common material, and dipped it in a latex, a very new material at the time. So really exploring, again, materials outside of the fine art canon. And after dipping it in the latex, she just hung it from the ceiling of her studio and really allowed the rope and the latex to form the piece itself. And that's a similar process that Morris took with his felt piece, where he started with big rectangles of basically packing felt, and by slicing lines into it, almost making a kind of geometric abstract canvas, when the work is installed, it's pulled up from one point and then all the felt just kind of falls around it. So again, taking materials on their own terms and kind of allowing the materials to do to be the ones driving the intentions of the work and not kind of the artist defining how they should be seen.
So from the late 60s into the 1970s and to the kind of heart and soul of the show, the kind of height of second wave feminism, which was really such a kind of touchstone for us, both chronologically and thematically for this project. Here you see artists, primarily women artists, who were, struggling to receive recognition and attention, who wanted to kind of take up this question of the feminine, quote unquote, of materials or references to the domestic sphere, who wanted to kind of mess around with these hierarchies and to bring this kind of political edge into their work. And so the artists that you can see on this wall are Harmony Hammond, and Diane Simpson, Emmy Whitehorse, and Miriam Shapiro. And again, you can see like this commitment to cross-medium displays, right? Do you have sculpture, you have prints, you have drawings, and you have collage painting, kind of all dealing with craft in different kinds of ways, either kind of literally or more metaphorically, as is the case with Emmy Whitehorse's pastel drawing, which is about a blanket, but is not actually a blanket. So even thinking about craft as a kind of subject was something we were really interested in exploring. And the Miriam Shapiro is such a kind of perfect example of this moment. In the 1960s, Shapiro was working as a geometric abstract painter, kind of hard edge, really clear, and really bold kind of abstract painting that was, at the time, totally de rigueur. And then she had this kind of awakening, this kind of moment where she realized she didn't want to work in this kind of male-dominated mode. She wanted to take up the very materials that were so rejected by her male colleagues in the art world. And she started making what she called femage, which is a kind of combination of feminine and collage, where she wanted to take all of these references to domestic space, so bits of apron or doilies or other kinds of heavily patterned and ornamented fabrics, cut them all up, rearrange them, paint over them, make a mess with them, really kind of call attention to the possibility that there could be beauty and excitement and vitality and politics in the ornamental. And the kind of messiness of this gallery, we actually don't have that many views of it, but the gallery includes ceramics and paintings on textiles that are unframed. It includes embroidery. It includes all of the materials that I mentioned before, so prints and drawings and paintings, and the kind of wild possibilities that so many of the artists at this time made possible. I think Elisabeth and I feel we could really argue lays the groundwork for like everything you're going to see in the rest of the exhibition. So it's really these primarily women who make possible so much of the kind of exuberance and ornamentality that we see kind of coming to the fore, especially in the 1980s, which is where we'll go next. You want to take over, Elisabeth?
Yep. So that was actually the transition I was going to use, which was how that 1970s second wave feminist moment really laid the groundwork for everything that was to come. And as you walk into this room in the 1980s, not for every work, but increasingly going forward in the exhibition, the politics inherent in the materials become much more of the driving force for the artists. So kind of merging the politics of the materials with the politics of the narrative in the objects themselves. And in this 1980s room, again, it was a wonderful chance for us to kind of tell a story of this moment in a slightly different way than we generally have. And really kind of excitingly for us and beautifully, the checklist kind of drove the thematic in this room. And as we started to bring together the objects that kind of fit the bill time-wise and material-wise, we started to realize that what was holding them all together was a sense of devotion. And what that, in some cases, in many cases, is devotion in a religious sense. Many of the artists in this room had specifically Catholic or Greek Orthodox upbringing, and you really see that in the kind of ornamentation in the works themselves that come from those religious traditions, or other kinds of devotion. And namely, what's happening in the 1980s, and is familiar to so many of us is we're running headlong into the AIDS crisis. And many of these artists are using devotion to materials to think about devotion and ideas of care, and how in the absence of care from our government do we care for one another. And it's very hard to talk about right now, honestly, because we are obviously in another pandemic, where care and loss and tragedy are all around us. And this work in particular by Arch Connolly, these works that are kind of more recent additions to our collection that have been such a joy to get to know, really speak to this kind of combination of these concerns for artists at this moment, merging craft materials and craft ideas with these senses of devotion and care and queer aesthetics. So Connolly's work, and this is slightly out of context, so I'll just describe what you're seeing. On the left, you're seeing a kind of wall-mounted sculpture about yay big, almost like a little shelf that you would put in your house and maybe put a candle or a vase on top of, but there's the top is kind of poured with resin and has some things inlaid, and then it's completely encrusted with fake pearls and rhinestones and all of these materials that are actually really cheap, really common. We call it almost like the kind of Michael's craft aesthetic versus this high studio craft aesthetic. But in their accumulation, in their overabundance, they take on this whole other life, and that sense of accumulation and abundance and kind of joy of materials is something that really comes from the queer community at this time. And on the right, you see that very much. This is a painting on a panel. It's significantly larger than the small wall-mounted sculpture. You can see actually the kind of raw wood coming through in the sunset part of the landscape in the background. And then he's used these same materials, these pearls and rhinestones, to create this explosion on this landscape. The title of the work is actually Personal Explosion. And when you think about a gay man making this in 1984, he's really talking about sex and about joy and about pleasure, and how at this moment, these things that are supposed to be such a part of the human existence and such a part of how we experience joy and pleasure are really frightening and demonized and linked with disease and death. And he's kind of reclaiming them and making it beautiful again and making it celebratory again. So it's a kind of very powerful and emotional message, completely coated in sparkles. And in the other part of the room, you have a number of different approaches to this idea of devotion. I love talking on the left about Rosie Lee Tompkins, this quilt, an artist maybe some of you are familiar with. She was a quilt maker in a great African-American quilt making tradition, who really was, many of the artists in this room, when they are associating with their religious upbringings, are kind of pushing against those traditions. She's someone who really embraced her faith, and she thought of this quilt making process as something she did as kind of in communication with God. And she would take scraps of materials, things were associated with family members, and make these really beautiful kind of ecstatic works. Jenny?
Sorry, I thought I had one more image of a detail, but anyway, we love that room because you really get a sense of the kind of range of possibility, really the material expansiveness and the kind of love of material that so many artists bring to their work. And from this moment, kind of at the height of the AIDS crisis, as Elisabeth was saying, deeply embedded in queer aesthetics, we move into the 1990s and then kind of on into the present. So if we're doing a kind of like march through contemporary art history, we've arrived at the height of what we sometimes call identity politics. You know, as artists are kind of very invested in thinking about their representation of self and how self functions in the world, and the ways in which we are always subject to these forces that are kind of culturally prescriptive forces or systemic forces that that limit and delimit our experience of the world. And we wanted to.
Speaking of which, I just wanted to say, Jenny and I are both mothers of young children. And if you hear our children in the background periodically, that's just a fact of our working lives in the middle of a pandemic. So
yeah, exactly. So this gallery has to do a lot of work. It covers the 90s to the present, essentially. But what all of these works can share in common is a deep investment in the relationship of the body to place. This idea that, how we understand ourselves physically and philosophically and personally is always tied to these broader kind of cultural, site-driven parameters or containers. And one of the driving forces for this exhibition, one of the real motivators for Elisabeth and me was how could we as curators at the Whitney make a show that would allow us to put Liza Lu's kitchen on view. This is a sculptural installation that we have admired and loved. We'd seen it in pieces in storage and we'd seen images of it, but it had never gone on view. It wasn't something that our curatorial predecessors were particularly interested in. It's been in the collection since 2008. But we wanted to figure out a way, and we were like, we'll build a whole show around it if we have to. We want to get this work out, and that's exactly what we did. So let's see if I have some other, here we go. This is not a beautiful image, but it gives you a sense of the scale of this kitchen, which is a life-size, to scale, one-to-one scale kitchen space that includes some real objects, a real fridge, a real stove and oven, and a real sink, and other things made from wood and paper mache, all entirely covered with glass beads. So each laid down with, one at a time. So it's not beaded, it's applied one after another after another. And this is something that Liza Lu started making when she was young. She had dropped out of art school. She was really interested in thinking about the labor of an artist, about expectations of women's work, and wanting to kind of mess around with that. She thought this was going to take her a couple of months, and 5 years later, she was like emerging from this all-consuming world that she'd created. It's full of the most incredible kind of shimmering details, and this is just another view so you can see that it's like this rough plywood exterior and then this glittering, shimmering thing inside. Here we go, some of the details from when we were laying everything out before we installed it. So you can really get a sense of housewife beats the world, right? The kind of humor that she brings to this and the kind of unbelievable precision and patience that she brought to this work. Here is a detail shot where you can see some of the pieces in storage. So one of the things that Elisabeth and I always love sharing with people about this is this bowl that you can see says "Yum!" exclamation point in beads, but in the installation proper, it's filled with sorry, it's filled with fake Cap'n Crunch. So you can't, as a visitor, see the inside of that bowl. So this is really like behind the scenes.
And actually, speaking of behind the scenes, one of the great joys of the installation for us was that our registrars allowed us, which they never allow us to do, to put on a glove and touch one piece of Cap'n Crunch and place it in the bowl. It was like curator's dreams come
true. And feel the weight, they're glass, it's pieces of glass. So it's like, it's got this real presence, and the sink overflowing with dishes, the water kind of pouring down from the faucet. All these details are just so incredible.
I want to share one more detail that just, I know I'm taking too much time, but that feels relevant to our moment. If you go back to the sink, she actually was thinking about cleanliness and dirt. And so there's so many layers to the ideas of the kitchen, but on the plate, on the left hand of the sink towards the front with the red rim, that pattern on the plate is actually thinking about like the microscopic shapes of germs. And needless to say, we're all so obsessed with washing and shapes of germs right now that I am looking at that plate anew.
Why don't you keep going here?
Great. So just a couple more works from this room, and again to kind of emphasize once more the sense of cross-medium display. So it was really important to us in addition to trying to include video, to also include photography. And on the left was many of the works in this room were new acquisitions for the show. It was actually sort of shocking and unsurprising to see how in the last 10 years or so, despite the proliferation of craft materials and ideas in the contemporary art world, that our collection and therefore our staff was really biased away from these ways of working. And so we actually did have to do some acquiring in order to fill out this room. So these works by Erica Baum, this wonderful photographer who uses printed materials and takes photographs of them, looking at sewing patterns and allowing the transparency of the sewing patterns to create kind of new patterns by taking the photograph through the layers of the pattern, and then the words that become kind of found poetry. And then on the right, Erin Jane Nelson, an artist I could speak at length about, who's actually very, very committed to arts of the American South and the kind of regional craft traditions, and has taught me so much about the South. Here, it's just a work from her series about the barrier islands on the Southeast, these spaces that are essentially going into the ocean with rising sea levels, and thinking about these lands and the many layers of complicated American history that they hold, from indigenous people to settler colonialists to slavery to oil rigs, and then now many of them are kind of very exclusive luxury vacation resorts. And this one in particular, Daufuski Island, that this was made for, has many of those histories. And so she thinks of them as kind of preemptive memorials to these very complicated places that will likely soon disappear.
And just really quickly, as we love this room, but there's one more room we want to show you. We wanted to really think about Indigenous artists in this moment. And one of the really exciting new acquisitions that we made is the work in the kind of center of your screen by Marie Watt, which is called Skywalker Skyscraper. And it's a work that's a steel I-beam around that's essentially impaling blankets. Blankets are stacked on top of it. And much of her sculptural work deals with blankets. She's Seneca, and she's thinking about kind of long Indigenous traditions of blankets being bestowed upon people at kind of important moments in our lives. And if we think about the ways in which we're kind of born among them, in some traditions we're buried among them, and then they have these kind of crucial roles to play in certain rites of passage and other kind of crucial turning points. And one of the things that's so exciting for us about this work at the Whitney, thinking specifically about the land acknowledgement I gave at the beginning, and thinking about the site and place that we're in, is that this has a specific explicit reference to the skyscrapers of New York City, many of which were built in the 20s and 30s and 40s, many of which were built by Mohawk, Seneca, and other Haudenosaunee iron workers who would come down from what's now Western New York to work temporarily in the city. And they were famous for, climbing high heights and not using high harnesses, and often were called the Skywalkers. So really situating this specific work in this place, which if you're looking at it from the other direction, you can actually see out the window and into the cityscape and see some of the kind of buildings that these objects are connected to, is really important to us. And then just some detailed views of some of the amazing works in the show: Jeffrey Gibson, Nick Cave, and maybe I'll give it to Elisabeth, sorry.
Yeah. Why don't we just, given the time left, Jenny, could you just advance to the next slide with Marlo? Detail of a few more works in this room. I'll just say these artists' names because they're all artists who deserve way more recognition than they might have. Jordan Nasser on the left, who makes these beautiful works using a traditional Palestinian embroidery technique called tatriz. Shan Goshorn in the center, who uses indigenous basket weaving techniques to look at very specific histories, and often embeds in the weaving texts that refer to these histories, and then Khalil Robert Irving on the right, an incredible ceramicist, making works often very much in response to police brutality and the Black Lives Matter movement, among many, many, many other things. I'm totally skimming over the surface of all of these works. Elaine Rychek, the godmother of this whole show. And then finally, we get to our last room, which you can see has this curtain wall of windows overlooking New York City. It faces east. And this kind of loops in a lot of ways back to the beginning of our presentation and our Renzo Piano building, and also kind of back to our beginnings of complicating and reinforcing these ideas about craft. So one of the challenges of our incredible building are these curtain windows, which are so good for the viewer, so good to be able to have this connection to the city, to kind of life outside of the museum space, to sense of time and light. But artworks hate light, as we know so well. And so it's very hard to hang works near these windows. But what's incredible is that ceramics have basically already seen the surface of the sun, being fired at 1100 degrees or more. And so they can take everything that these windows can give to them. So in this show, we had this wonderful opportunity to actually make an expansive gallery using natural light. And we wanted to end the show on this medium specific note, after being so cross media, after kind of undoing hierarchies and categories, to say, yes, all of that is important, but also artist devotion to material is important too. And we have all of these incredible ceramics in our collection that might not have fit into the story as we were telling it, but are so crucial to thinking about craft in art from 1950 to 2019. And so to do this one moment that is more about the material and less about the narrative. And so you see everything from like David Gilhooly's mer frog and her pet fish, this enormous multi-part ceramic of this mer frog and her singing fish on this rock, this kind of like beautiful, ugly work that's really a part of this kind of West Coast ceramics boom in the 70s. Shio Kusaka on the right, somebody who is kind of really straddles the lines in so many ways between functional and art object. And then thinking about kind of the high finish of something handmade, like a Ken Price, where it looks like it could be industrially fabricated, but you know that this is just the pinnacle of skill that went into making this work, to something like the Paul McCarthy on the right, which it was so important to us to have at least one object in the show that was mass produced. And so this comes from a body of work where he sourced all of these Disney these sort of porcelain Disney collectibles and signed them. And that was kind of what turned them into his own work of art. And then we end with this beautiful Arlene Sheckett looking out over the cityscape. This is making me so long for our building and for our show and for life in the city outside of our small little bubbles that we're living in right now. But I think we'll leave it there and open it up for questions. But I just want to thank you all so much for taking the time to listen to us tonight. We really miss our show, and it really is such a joy to be able to share it with you all this way. And because it is on view until February 22, as Jenny said in the beginning, I do hope you have a chance to come see Liza Lou's Kitchen in person, to come see all of these wonderful works, and maybe we can meet you then. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Jenny and Elisabeth. I've actually never been to the Whitney, and this exhibition looks amazing. I have to say, a lot of familiar artists that we have in our collection. So it was really good to see other examples of works by them. I wish we could really visit you in person soon, hopefully. So at this time, we'll take some questions. Please continue to post any questions or comments that you have in the chat box. I've had a lot of questions come in sort of private message to me. So let's sort of jump right in. You mentioned that you didn't already have Ani Albers in your collection when organizing the exhibition. Has that since changed?
Yeah,
Yes,
so
go ahead.
Jenny.
Or the prints that we showed at the very beginning, that we acquired this beautiful suite of 7 lithographs from 1964. The first that she ever made, or I guess like the second she ever made, but the first complete suite. And they are on view right now for the very first time. But we don't own a weaving, but we are really excited to have the prints.
If anyone knows of one that wants to
we'll fight you for it.
Seriously.
Another question, is craft typically displayed in separate areas from fine art at the Whitney?
That's a really good question, and brings up something I realized we overlooked when talking about the new building and in introducing the show. So first, we don't separate out any media in our displays. When we were at the Breuer building, for example, we had a photography gallery. We don't have any galleries like that anymore. So all displays are cross media, or all spaces can be used for any media. But the other thing to note about the show and our collection really is that it has been to date what one would traditionally consider a fine art collection. So all of the objects in the show and in our collection are made by kind of people who self-identify as artists and not people who self-identify as craftspeople. So like Shio Kusaka, it's a functional bowl, or we had 2 Betty Woodman ceramics in the show that are completely functional objects, and she was happy for them to be used as functional objects, but she very much was engaged in a fine art dialogue. So that is something that that's just the nature of our collection and the way that we were able to tell this story. So no, there's kind of no, we could not make that division in our displays because we don't really have that in the collection.
Great, thank you. Someone wants to know if there is a catalog for this exhibition.
No,
Jenny, do you want...
No, alas. We typically don't do books for our collection displays, although we really wish we did, because we feel like there's a lot of interesting ideas and ways in to this topic through the show, but no. But we do have a really good audio guide you could listen to on the website. And I hope we'll do some more public programming related to the show since it's up for such a long time. But yeah, no catalog. Sorry.
Okay. Sorry to disappoint whoever asked that question. So many of these works are large in scale. Was that your choice as the curators to make crafts stand out and get noticed, or was that just the nature of what you had in the collection?
I love this question. Such a good question. We went into this before we started to mine our database and put together our checklist, thinking that we were going to have a show of lots of wonderfully itty bitty things that were handmade, lat made, on that kind of a scale. And actually what we found was that in these materials, artists worked really large scale in a way that we had to make more choices than we thought we would. But we really believe firmly that, and in so many cases it's explicit, sort of as we were saying about in the beginning about the Ree Morton, many of these artists are making work at large scale because they come from marginalized identity places, and they are using these materials because they are marginalized materials associated with these marginalized identities. So they take them and they take up space, and that is a really political intention of their practice and something we really wanted to emphasize.
Wonderful. At the beginning, you talked about how the Whitney is on land that belonged to displaced Indigenous people. And of course, everywhere in America has the same issue, and we also acknowledge it here at our museum. Can you talk a little bit more broadly about museums across the country and their responsibility to acknowledge that they are on displaced land?
Well, I mean, I think that it is the responsibility of all settlers to acknowledge that they are guests on oftentimes unceded ancestral territory, and that the indigenous peoples of that place are often still there or in a kind of forced diaspora, like many of the Lenape. And I think that's just the bare minimum. There's plenty more to be done beyond that in terms of redistribution of resources, giving indigenous peoples land back, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, so an acknowledgement is like just the basics, and I think is just a kind of essential first step for all settler nations. And in fact, the United States is kind of like behind the times in even doing land acknowledgement. It's like very common practice in New Zealand, Australia, and Canada, and in the United States less so, but that's, I think, starting to change. But it is really just it's really just a bare minimum. Sometimes when I give land acknowledgements, especially for New York audiences, I'll end by being like, and you can donate to this fund that supports Lenape art and artists, because, redistributing resources is a really important part of the work. But yeah, knowing where you are is really powerful. And if you don't know whose land you're on, there's a lot of ways you can do that. You can just kind of look that up on the internet. There's a great website called nativeland.net, where you can kind of look up wherever you are and learn more about the lands. If you're all in Asheville, then you're on Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians land, but you might not all be in Asheville right now. So
I just dropped that link in the chat if anybody wants to take a look at it.
And also to see, like if you didn't grow up in Asheville, like knowing where the lands that you maybe feel ancestrally tied to yourselves are, of course, indigenous lands. So I think it's just an important part of the conversation. And there are, a handful of indigenous artists in our show. There's 80 works by about 60 artists, and the Whitney has a collection of 26,000 objects, but yet some tiny fraction of those are by indigenous artists. So there's so much work to be done.
Thank you, Jenny. The question is, how would you describe the line between craft in art and craft? Is this line blurring or even going away?
So I think there are kind of two answers to this question, or maybe a two-part answer. One is for us, for me personally, it's really about the maker's intention. So it's not about some external idea of what an object is or should be, or how it should be, how it should exist in the world. It's what is the artist's intention, and then I'm happy to kind of follow along. I think that's a lot of what drives us institutionally is kind of artist intention. But I do think that part of our hope of this show is not to begin this conversation. This is a long conversation. This is a conversation that many others have started before us, that other institutions are solely devoted to, but to just add another drop in the bucket towards challenging these categories. I think we're in a moment where we're really wonderfully challenging the way that we categorize a lot of things, and this is part of it for us, that maybe these separate buckets are harmful and not helpful to the objects, to the makers, to the communities that enjoy them.
Thank you. Besides the quilt, are there other self-taught craft artists in the exhibition?
I'm looking at Jenny. I was going to see if she wanted to take this, and please interrupt, Jenny, if you have a different answer. That's another distinction that I think is one that's being challenged. And I would just say, kind of in response to the way the question was phrased, there are many artists who did not go to art school. And so this idea of kind of what does it mean to be self-taught, and who do we put in that category, and why do we put certain people in that category, I think is a really important one to ask.
But also it's interesting to think about artists who did go to art school and were trained in quote unquote traditional ways, but then nevertheless found their way to techniques and methods that you would never learn in art school. Like I'm thinking about someone like Elaine Rychek, who I think went to art school. or she's certainly steeped in the language of, you know, the avant-garde.
Or Mike Kelly, or
Yeah, but like still ended up making a career out of embroidery, right? And specifically intentionally making this kind of material choice. So there's a lot of ways to kind of come at this kind of question, sort of to Elisabeth's point.
Thank you. You talk a lot about texture and materiality in the exhibition. How do you convey the importance of that when visitors, as in most museums, aren't encouraged to touch the works? Did you have any interesting education programs planned for the exhibition in order to convey the texture and materiality?
Well, okay. So first of all, we do have access programs. So for people who are blind and low vision, we have these amazing touch-based tours and verbal description tours as part of our kind of ongoing programming. And I think those programs are still happening remotely. So they'd be much more reliant on verbal description and other kinds of methods. But this question of the like tactility of this show and the sumptuousness and the deep desire to touch was one that was really a huge part of our planning. You may have noticed that there are platforms like running built into the show that were running kind of all throughout. We wanted to build the protections that registrars and conservators require into the exhibition design, which is not something that is always done well anywhere, and something we wanted to take very seriously so that we could get the absolute best experience, knowing that people can't actually touch. You can only touch with your eyes.
I mean, and one thing we hope, and look, we are equally as frustrated as every visitor that we can't touch these things, as evidenced by my story about installing the kitchen and getting to touch the cereal. But we do hope, one of the things we love about this show and love about these objects is that they are materials that everybody has some relationship to, or most people have some relationship to some of these materials. So like we talk often when you get to the room of ceramics, like almost everybody at some point in their life, whether it's at school aged or later on, has touched wet clay. And if not, you drink your coffee every morning out of ceramic. And so even if you can't touch the actual object, the sensory memory, that kind of like lingering, I was going to like use some really obnoxious art terms, but it is just such a part of experiencing these works. And that's why we really hope you do all get to see the show in person.
I hope so too. So sort of related to that, but more of a logistical question. For the Liza Lu, is the floor also covered in glass beads? If so, what are the logistics of installation as far as someone stepping into the space to place the objects within it?
Yeah, great question. They're individual tiles and each tile is beaded. So it gets built. So the sink goes in, the fridge goes in, the counters go in, and then the tiles so you're like it's like when you mop the kitchen floor, back your way out.
That's a great analogy. Okay, one last question. You mentioned acquiring works for the show. How many of the works were in the collection roughly already, and what types of work had to be acquired other than the Albers?
Great question. I used to have these numbers. It's been some time.
Guesstimate is fine.
Yeah, I would say maybe like a dozen so works were acquired for the show. Again, a lot of them were kind of contemporary and emerging works, but then there were really key figures along the way who we didn't want to leave out. The other are kind of the two artists that we did not feel comfortable doing the show without their presence in it were Annie Albers, as Jenny has said, and Faith Ringgold. And unfortunately, in this version of the presentation, we didn't linger on the Faith Ringgold that we have on view, but it's this wonderful work from her Tonka painting series with a quote by Shirley Chisholm painted on the surface about her two handicaps, being a woman and being Black. It's an incredible early work. And while we have work of Ringgold's in the collection, we of course have works on paper or there was a great desire for painting, and we saw this as another real bias against these materials, that everyone, as there's been this kind of renewed attention to her work, has been clamoring over the works that are made in these kind of more traditional fine art ways, when so much of her career has been dedicated to soft materials, to fabric, and that so that was a real triumph for us. And then I'll say we have a few loans in the show, mostly from one of our trustees, Beth Rudin DeWoody, who is a voracious collector of everything. And we could have done the whole show simply from her collection, but there were a few works that just kind of weren't possible to acquire in the time frame and budgets that we had, like Barbara Chase Revue, who we just also did not want to do the show without, and a number of other people. Or where, like Jeff Gibson, where we have great work in the collection, but we really wanted a work like this. And so we were fortunately able to loan just a few works to fill in those gaps.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. You guys have been so incredibly generous with your time. I did have someone send me a comment, Jenny, that your focus is unbelievable. It was great seeing your daughter tonight too. And thank you all for joining us tonight.
There's no
virtually.
escape.
Yeah, no, it's fine. We're used to it this year.
Let us out of our boxes.
Yeah, well, if there's anybody on the call who's like missing their grandkids, this is like your, or kids, this is like your chance. But yes, trapped at home.
Yeah,
thank you. This was really fun.
Thanks so much. We'll be sending out an evaluation to collect your feedback on this evening's program, so please watch your email. The museum is currently open to visitors. We're operating at a reduced capacity and have a number of new safety measures in place. You can learn more about those safety measures at ashevilleart.org/visit. And if you enjoyed tonight's program, I have to say, please consider making a donation to our annual fund. Through the end of the year, all gifts, new memberships, and upgraded memberships will be matched dollar for dollar up to $75,000, thanks to the generosity of a longtime foundation supporter. Please also mark your calendars for our next two Art Travels programs. On January 7th, we'll virtually visit the Columbus Museum, an institution unique for its dual focus on art and history. Staff from the curatorial and education departments will introduce us to the museum, then discuss their exhibition, What's Going Around, Lou Stovall and the Community Poster, 1967 to 1976. Then on February 4th, the executive director will virtually welcome and introduce us to the Birmingham Museum of Art. Then the curator of Jacob Lawrence, The American Struggle, will give us an overview of that important exhibition. Both programs are now posted on our website. More information and registration at ashevilleart.org. We hope to see you in the galleries or at another virtual program through our Museum from Home initiative. Thank you all again for your support. Stay well and have a great rest of your week.